Story 1. Susquehanna Screamer. The scream that shattered the Pennsylvania night wasn't human, but it came from something that used to be. I had driven down Susquehanna Road on a dare, following the ritual that every local teenager knew by heart. 3 honks of the car horn at the spot where the old railroad bridge used to stand. 3 honks to summon the ghost they called the Susquehanna Screamer. I was 42 years old, way too mature for this kind of nonsense. But my nephew Danny had been bragging about his encounters with the ghost, and I wanted to prove to him that there was nothing supernatural haunting these Pennsylvania backwoods. The first scream changed everything. It erupted from the tree line about 50 yards to my left, a sound so raw and filled with anguish that it seemed to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. Every window in my pickup truck vibrated from the sonic assault, and my hands involuntarily jerked on the steering wheel. But that was just the beginning. Susquehanna Road cuts through some of the most isolated country in Pittston Township, winding through dense forest that hasn't changed much since the coal mining days of the early 1900s. It's the kind of place where cell phones don't work and GPS signals get lost among the trees. During the day, it's just another forgotten world. At night, it becomes something else entirely. I had parked my truck at the exact spot where the Pennsylvania Railroad Bridge had crossed the road until it was demolished in 1987. Local legend claimed this was ground zero for the supernatural activity that had been plaguing the area for decades. The story varied depending on who told it. Some said the Susquehanna Screamer was a young bride who had hanged herself from the bridge after discovering her husband's infidelity. Others claimed she was a high school girl who had died in a prom night car accident on this very stretch of road. But every version agreed on the essential details. A young woman in a white dress who wandered the woods along Susquehanna Road, releasing screams of such pure agony that they could be heard for miles. I had expected maybe some owls or coyotes that I could later claim were supernatural voices. What I heard instead defied every rational explanation I could construct. The second scream came from the opposite side of the road, closer this time. Close enough that I could hear the individual inflections of a female voice stretched beyond the breaking point by whatever torment she was experiencing. It wasn't the sound of someone being hurt. It was the sound of someone who had been broken so completely that screaming was the only response their shattered mind could produce. I started the engine, ready to get the hell out of there, but something in my peripheral vision made me freeze. A figure in white was moving through the trees about 100 yards ahead, visible only as flashes of pale fabric between the dark trunks. She was moving parallel to the road, and her gait was all wrong. Too fast, too fluid, like she was floating rather than walking. The screaming stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the sound had been. Even the normal forest noises, insects, small animals, wind through leaves, had gone quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath. I put the truck in drive and began slowly following the white figure. She stayed just at the edge of my headlight beam, always visible but never clearly defined. Sometimes she seemed to be wearing a wedding dress, complete with a long train that dragged behind her. Other times, she looked like she was in a prom dress, the kind of formal gown that teenage girls spend months saving up to buy. The figure led me deeper into the forest along a dirt path that branched off from the main road. I had lived in this area my entire life and had never known this trail existed. It wound through stands of old-growth timber that should have been logged decades ago, trees so massive they formed a canopy that blocked out the stars. After about a mile, the path opened into a clearing where I found something that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. A car from the 1950s Saturday in the middle of the clearing, perfectly preserved despite being surrounded by decades of forest growth. It was a white Cadillac convertible with red leather seats, the kind of car you might rent for a special occasion like a wedding or prom. I ran. The driver's door was standing open, and the interior light was somehow still glowing after all these years. But it wasn't the car itself that terrified me. It was what I could see inside. Dark stains covered the red leather seats, stains that could only be blood, preserved by the cold Pennsylvania winters and protected from decomposition by the forest canopy. The steering wheel was bent as if someone had gripped it with superhuman strength during their final moments. And hanging from the rearview mirror was a corsage, a white orchid corsage that looked like it had been made yesterday, despite the fact that the car had obviously been sitting in this clearing for decades. I got out of my truck and approached the Cadillac, drawn by a morbid curiosity that overrode my common sense. As I got closer, I could see more details that painted a horrific picture of what had happened here. The windshield was cracked in a spider web pattern, as if something had struck it from the inside with tremendous force. The passenger seat had deep gouges in the leather, like claw marks. And scattered across the floor were pieces of what looked like a torn white dress. That's when I found the newspaper clipping tucked under the windshield wiper. The paper was yellowed with age, but the headline was still clearly readable. Local girl dies in prom night tragedy. The date was May 15, 1963. According to the article, 18-year-old Catherine Morrison had been driving home from her senior prom when her car left the road on Susquehanna Road and crashed into a tree. She had been found 3 days later, having died from her injuries while trapped in the wreckage. But there were details in the article that didn't match what I was seeing. The paper claimed Catherine had been driving a blue Ford, not a white Cadillac. It said she had been found on the main road, not hidden away in some secret clearing in the woods. Someone had covered up what really happened that night. I looked more closely at the newspaper clipping and noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a second article on the same page, much smaller and buried in the back section. Local man dies in apparent suicide. Robert Hayes, age 19, had been found hanged from the old railroad bridge on Susquehanna Road just 2 days after Catherine Morrison's death. The article mentioned that Hayes had been Catherine's boyfriend and implied that grief over her death had driven him to take his own life. But now I was beginning to suspect a different story. What if Robert Hayes hadn't? He killed himself out of grief. What if he had killed himself out of guilt? The evidence in the clearing suggested that Catherine Morrison hadn't. He died in a simple car accident. The claw marks, the bent steering wheel, the torn dress, they all pointed to a violent struggle. Someone had attacked Catherine in this car, and that someone had left her to die in this hidden clearing where no one would find her for days. The official story about finding her on the main road was a lie, probably concocted to cover up the real crime. And when the guilt became too much to bear, Robert Hayes had ended his own life rather than face justice. But justice had found him anyway, in the form of Catherine, this restless spirit. The screaming started again as I stood there reading the newspaper clipping. This time, it was coming from directly behind me. I turned around and saw her clearly for the first time. Catherine Morrison stood at the edge of the clearing, no longer hiding among the trees. She was wearing a white prom dress that had once been beautiful but was now torn and stained with mud and worse things. Her dark hair was matted with leaves and debris, and her face was pale as moonlight. But it was her eyes that really got to me. They held a pain so deep and raw that it was almost physical. The pain of someone who had died violently and alone, abandoned in the woods by the person who was supposed to love her. She opened her mouth and released another scream, but this time I could hear words buried in the sound. She was calling a name over and over again, her voice breaking with each repetition. Robert, Robert, Robert. She wasn't just screaming from pain or madness. She was calling for her killer, demanding answers that would never come. I sprinted back to my truck and gunned the engine, not caring if I ran over saplings or scraped the paint on low branches. The dirt path seemed longer on the way out, and twice I thought I was going to get lost in the maze of forest tracks that crisscrossed this forgotten corner of Pennsylvania. But Catherine's screams followed me the entire way, echoing through the trees and seeming to come from all directions at once. When I finally made it back to Susquehanna Road, I didn't stop driving until I reached the lights of downtown Pittston. Only then did I feel safe enough to pull over and try to process what I had experienced. The next day, I went to the local library and spent hours researching the Catherine Morrison case. What I found confirmed my suspicions about a cover-up. Catherine's father had been a prominent local businessman with political connections. When his daughter died, he had used his influence to ensure that the investigation was handled quietly and quickly. The official cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries from a car accident, with no mention of the evidence that suggested foul play. Robert Hayes had been questioned in connection with Catherine's death, but he was never charged with a crime. His suicide 2 days later was treated as confirmation of his innocence. After all, why would a guilty man kill himself unless he was overcome with grief? But I had seen the real crime scene. I had seen the evidence that Catherine Morrison hadn't died in a simple accident. She had been murdered by someone who then abandoned her body in a hidden clearing where it took 3 days for anyone to find her. And her spirit had been trapped in those woods ever since, screaming for justice that never came. I never told anyone about what I found in that clearing. Who would believe such a story? But I did make sure that Danny never went looking for the Susquehanna Screamer. Some legends are better left alone, especially when they're not really legends at all. Catherine Morrison is still out there, still wandering the woods along Suscon Road, still screaming for answers that died with Robert Hayes in 1963, still trapped between life and death by the violent injustice of her murder. If you ever find yourself driving through Pittston Township late at night, and you hear stories about honking your horn 3 times to summon a ghost, remember this: some spirits errant be performing tricks for your entertainment. Some spirits are crying out for justice, and some screams echo through the darkness because the truth was buried along with the victim. The Suscon Screamer ISN, a legend. She is a witness to murder, and her testimony will continue echoing through those Pennsylvania woods until someone finally listens to what she is trying to say. Story 2. Prospector, this road whisperer. Have you ever heard a voice that doesn't belong to anyone living? I am talking about words spoken directly into your ear by someone who ISN to their clear as daylight but cold as death. It happened to me 3 months ago on a forgotten mining road outside Georgetown, California, and I haven't slept properly since. I was location scouting for a documentary about gold rush ghost towns when I first heard about Prospector, this road. The locals at the Georgetown Hotel warned me not to go alone, especially not after dark. They said the road was haunted by a miner who had been killed during the 1850s boom, murdered by claim jumpers who tortured him for information about his strike before cutting his throat and leaving him to bleed out in the Sierra Nevada wilderness. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and according to the old newspaper archives I dug up, he'd been a braggart, the kind of prospector who couldn't keep his mouth shut about his good fortune, always talking about the gold he found, the fortune he was building. The other miners tolerated his boasting because times were hard and everyone needed something to hope for. But tolerance turned to greed, and greed turned to murder on a cold October night. What made the story particularly chilling was how Whitmore died. The killers had tried to force him to reveal the location of his claim, but he refused to talk even under torture. They cut out his tongue before slitting his throat, ensuring he never speak again. But death, it seemed, had given him his voice back. For over a century and a half, people had reported hearing his voice on the remote road that led to where his claim had been. Not seeing his ghost, mind you, just hearing him whisper the same phrase over and over, protecting his territory with words spoken from beyond the grave. Get off my claim. I should have listened to the warnings, should have brought a crew, should have gone during daylight hours, should have respected the locals' advice about staying away. But I was on a tight deadline, and I needed footage of the area where Whitmore's body had been discovered. My documentary was about how gold rush greed still haunts California, and I thought his story would make the perfect centerpiece. So I drove out to Prospector, this road alone, just after sunset on a Thursday evening in October. The road itself was barely more than a dirt track carved into the hillside, winding through dense stands of ponderosa pine and manzanita that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. My rental car bounced and scraped over rocks and ruts that hadn't been maintained since the Eisenhower administration. The deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated I felt. My cell phone had lost signal within the first mile, and my GPS showed nothing but blank green space. I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes when I reached the spot marked on my historical survey map. A small clearing where Whitmore's camp had supposedly been located, now overgrown with brush and marked only by a few moss-covered stones that might have once been the foundation of a cabin. I parked the car and got out, breathing in the sharp scent of pine and the underlying mustiness of forest decay. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees, just the ticking of my car, this cooling engine, and the sound of my own breathing. I'd been in remote locations before, but this felt different. Oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I set up my camera and started filming, narrating the story of Thomas Whitmore as I walked around the clearing. The light was fading fast, and I needed to work quickly to get the shots I needed. I was describing the layout of his camp when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. A scraping noise, like metal against stone, coming from somewhere behind the tree line. I paused the camera and listened, but the sound had stopped. Probably just a branch scraping against a rock in the wind, I told myself. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still, so still that my voice seemed to hang in the space around me like smoke. I continued filming, but I could feel something watching me. That prickly sensation you get when you're in a crowded room and someone is staring at the back of your head. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see eyes in the darkness between the trees, but there was nothing. Just shadows and the faint gleam of my car, its headlights cutting through the gloom. That's when I heard the whisper. It came from directly beside my left ear, as clear and close as if someone was standing right next to me. A man's voice, rough and gravelly, speaking in a tone that was somehow both quiet and urgent. "Get off my claim." I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the camera. Nothing. The clearing was empty except for me and the growing darkness. But the voice had been real. Not my imagination, not the wind in the trees. Someone had spoken those words directly into my ear with breath I could have sworn I felt against my skin. My hands were shaking as I packed up my equipment. I'd gotten enough footage for the documentary, more than enough. Time to leave. But as I walked back toward my car, I heard it again. This time from the other side, whispered into my right ear with the same urgent intensity. "Get off my claim." I broke into a run, my camera bag bouncing against my hip as I sprinted the last few yards to the car. I threw my equipment into the back seat and turned the key, more relieved than I'd ever been to hear an engine start. The headlights pushed back the darkness, creating a small bubble of safety in the overwhelming black of the forest. But as I put the car in reverse, I heard the voice again. Not from beside me this time, but from inside the car. Right between my ears, as if the words were forming directly in my brain. "Get off my claim." I floored the accelerator, backing out of the clearing so fast that I nearly slammed into a tree. The car fishtail ed on the loose dirt as I spun it around and started back down the narrow road, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every few seconds, I'd hear it again, that same gravelly whisper, sometimes from one side, sometimes from the other, sometimes seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "Get off my claim. Get off my claim. Get off my claim." The voice followed me for the entire drive back to Georgetown, never more than a few seconds of silence between repetitions. It didn't matter that I had the radio turned up loud or that I was driving as fast as I dared on the winding dirt road. The whisper cut through everything, clear and insistent and getting angrier with each repetition. By the time I reached the main highway, sweat was streaming down my face despite the cool October air. The voice had stopped, but the silence was almost worse than the whispering. It felt like the calm before a storm, like something was building to a crescendo I didn't want to experience. I didn't stop driving until I reached Sacramento, 2 hours away from Georgetown and hopefully far enough from Prospector, this road, to be safe. I checked into the first hotel I found and spent the night with every light in the room turned on, jumping at every creak of the building, every footstep in the hallway outside my door. But the voice had followed me. It started again around 3 in the morning, that same rough whisper cutting through the silence of the hotel room. "Get off my claim." This time, though, there was something different about it. Something hungrier. The anger was still there, but underneath it was a kind of desperate possessiveness that made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it was stress, lack of sleep, maybe some kind of delayed shock from being alone in such an isolated place. But deep down, I knew better. Thomas Whitmore had died protecting his claim from thieves, and even death hadn't diminished his territorial instincts. Somehow, by filming at his old campsite, I triggered something. I'd become a trespasser on land he still considered his own. The whispering continued for 3 days. It would come at random intervals, sometimes when I was alone, sometimes in crowded places. Always the same words, always in that same gravelly tone that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly to my brain. I started wearing headphones constantly, blasting music or podcasts to try to drown it out. But nothing worked. The voice cut through everything. On the 4th day, I decided to research Thomas Whitmore more thoroughly. If I was being haunted by his ghost, maybe understanding him better would help me figure out how to make it stop. I spent hours in the California State Library, digging through old mining records and newspaper archives, looking for any detail that might give me insight into what he wanted. What I found was disturbing. Whitmore hadn't just been killed by claim jumpers. He'd been the victim of a conspiracy involving half the miners in the Georgetown area. His claim had been incredibly rich, producing more gold in 6 months than most claims produced in years. But instead of keeping quiet about his success, he bragged constantly, showing off nuggets in the local saloons, talking about how he was going to be the richest man in California. The other miners had grown jealous and resentful. They started meeting in secret, planning ways to force Whitmore to share his claim or reveal its exact location. When he refused, they turned to violence, 7 men had participated in his torture and murder, each taking a portion of his gold and agreeing to keep the location of his claim secret. But here is the thing that made my blood run cold. According to the historical records, every single one of those 7 men had died within a year of Whitmore's murder. Not from accidents or disease, but from mysterious circumstances that the local newspaper had described as supernatural visitations. One had been found dead in his cabin, his body unmarked but his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Another had drowned in the American River during the dry season, when the water level was barely ankle deep. A third had simply disappeared, leaving behind all his possessions and no trace of where he'd gone. The newspaper articles from the time were full of speculation about a curse, about Whitmore, this ghost taking revenge on his killers. But the deaths had eventually stopped, and the story had faded into local legend. Until now, by researching Whitmore, by filming at his claim site, I somehow reawakened something that had been dormant for over a century. I'd become the latest in a long line of people who trespassed on his territory, and he was making it clear that I wasn't welcome. The whispering grew more intense after my library research, as if Whitmore could sense that I was learning about him. The voice came more frequently, and the words began to change. Instead of just demanding that I get off his claim, he started describing what he'd do to me if I didn't comply. The descriptions were vivid and brutal, detailing tortures that matched what had been done to him during his final hours. He spoke of cutting and burning, of slow death in the darkness of abandoned mine shafts. Always in that same gravelly whisper, always seeming to come from just beside my ear no matter where I was. I tried everything I could think of to make it stop. I visited churches, spoke to priests about blessing and exorcism. I consulted with paranormal investigators who suggested sage burning and protective rituals. I even considered seeing a psychiatrist, wondering if the stress of my work was finally catching up with me in the form of auditory hallucinations. Nothing worked. If anything, the attempts to ward off Whitmore, this ghost, seemed to make him angrier. The whispers became more frequent, more violent, more personal. He began to describe not just what he'd do to me, but what he'd do to my family, my friends, anyone I cared about. He knew details about my life that no ghost should have known, intimate facts that made me realize he'd been watching me far longer than just since my visit to his clan. That is when I made the decision that probably saved my life. I drove back to Georgetown, not to Prospector, this road, but to the local museum, where I heard they had artifacts from the gold rush era. I needed to find something that had belonged to Whitmore, something I could use to communicate with him more directly. If he was going to haunt me forever, maybe I could at least understand what he wanted. The museum curator was an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who lived in Georgetown her entire life. When I told her I was researching Thomas Whitmore, her face went pale and she immediately asked if I'd been out to his claim. When I admitted that I had, she shook her head sadly and led me to a back room where the museum kept items they didn't display. She pulled out a small wooden box and opened it carefully, revealing a collection of personal effects that had been found with Whitmore's body. A pocket watch, a few coins, a small leather journal with pages stained dark with what I assumed was blood, and wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the box, something that made my heart race. A gold nugget the size of a walnut, still bearing the chisel marks where it had been pried from solid rock. Mrs. Patterson explained that the nugget had been clutched in Whitmore's hand when his body was discovered. Even death hadn't loosened his grip on it. The item had been given to the museum decades earlier by the family of one of the men who found the body, with instructions that it should never be sold or given away. It was cursed, they said, and anyone who tried to profit from it would suffer the same fate as those who killed its original owner. I asked if I could hold it, just for a moment. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. The moment the gold touched my palm, the whispering stopped. For the first time in over a week, there was complete silence in my head. No gravelly voice, no threats, no demands that I get off his claim. Just blessed, perfect quiet. But as I held the nugget, I began to understand something about Thomas Whitmore that the historical records had missed. He wasn't angry about trespassers. He was lonely. The impressions that came from the gold were overwhelming. I felt his isolation during those final months, working alone at his claim while the other miners plotted against him. I felt his desperation as they tortured him, Not just the physical pain, but the emotional agony of realizing that men he considered friends had betrayed him. And most of all, I felt his regret. He died protecting his claim not because of greed, but because it was the only thing he had left. In life, he'd been a man who lost everything else that mattered to him. His family back east had disowned him when he headed west to seek his fortune. The woman he loved had married another man rather than wait for him to return. The claim was his last hope of proving himself worthy, of building something meaningful from the ruins of his life. When I filmed at his campsite, when I told his story to my camera, I'd given him something he'd been craving for more than a century and a half. I'd given him attention, acknowledgement that he existed and that his life had mattered. But I also left, taking that recognition with me and leaving him alone again in the darkness of the forest. He didn't want me off his claim. He wanted me to stay. I set the nugget back in its cloth wrapping and asked Mrs. Patterson if there was any way the museum could loan it to me, just temporarily. She refused, explaining that too many people had already suffered because of that cursed piece of gold. But she did offer me something else. She gave me copies of pages from Whitmore's journal, entries he made during his final weeks. They revealed a man who was intelligent, articulate, and increasingly desperate. He wrote about the other miners, growing hostility, about his certainty that they were planning something terrible. But he also wrote about his claim, describing its location in detail and expressing his hope that someday someone would find it and appreciate the work he put into it. That night, I made a decision that most people would consider insane. I drove back out to Prospector, this road, but this time I wasn't carrying a camera. I was carrying photocopies of Whitmore's journal entries and a promise. I found the clearing where his camp had been and built a small fire using dead wood from the forest floor. Then I read his journal entries aloud, giving voice to words that had been written in desperation more than a century ago. As I read, I felt his presence gathering around me like a cold fog, but there was no hostility in it now. Just a profound sense of gratitude. When I finished reading, I spoke directly to the darkness around me. I told Thomas Whitmore that I understood his loneliness, that I recognized his need to have his story told. I promised that my documentary would honor his memory, that I'd make sure people knew he'd been more than just a cautionary tale about gold rush greed. He'd been a human being with dreams and fears and the same desire for recognition that drives all of us. The whisper came one last time, but now it was different. Instead of anger, there was peace in that gravelly voice. Instead of threats, there was something that sounded almost like gratitude. Thank you. I never heard from Thomas Whitmore again. The documentary I made about gold rush ghosts featured his story prominently, presenting him not as a monster but as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. It won several awards and was viewed by thousands of people, giving him the recognition he'd been seeking for more than a century and a half. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in my editing room, I think I can feel him watching over my shoulder. Not threatening, not demanding, just making sure I'm telling stories that matter. Making sure that the voices of the forgotten dead continue to be heard. Because that's what Thomas Whitmore taught me during those terrifying weeks when his voice haunted my every moment. The dead don't always want to scare us. Sometimes they just want to be remembered. Sometimes they just want someone to acknowledge that they lived, that they mattered, that their stories deserve to be told. The Prospector, S-Road Whisperer ISN, to a malevolent ghost seeking revenge. He is a lonely soul who found peace when someone finally listened to what he had to say. And in the end, that made all the difference. Story 3. Phantom Patrolman. The flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror should have been a relief. Instead, they made my blood turn to ice water. I had been driving Mount Misery Road for 20 minutes, lost in the maze of winding back roads that snake through the woods of West Hills, New York. My GPS had died somewhere near Sweet Hollow Road, leaving me with nothing but darkness and the kind of suffocating silence that makes you question whether civilization still exists. The police cruiser had appeared out of nowhere, as if it had materialized from the shadows between the trees. No sound of an approaching engine, no gradual appearance of headlights in my mirrors. 1 second the road behind me was empty. The next those lights were strobing in my rear window, demanding I pull over. I eased my Honda onto the narrow shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires. The woods pressed in on both sides of the road, ancient oaks and maples forming a canopy so thick that no moonlight penetrated to the asphalt below. My headlights carved out a small circle of visibility ahead, revealing nothing but more empty road disappearing into the darkness. Behind me, the patrol car sat silent except for those pulsing lights. No spotlight, no radio chatter, no sound of the car door. Just red and blue washing over my interior in rhythmic waves that made everything look like a crime scene photograph. I rolled down my window and waited. The October air was cold enough to make me shiver, carrying the smell of rotting leaves and something else. Something medicinal and sharp, like disinfectant mixed with ash. Minutes passed. The lights kept flashing, but no officer approached. I could see the silhouette of someone behind the wheel of the cruiser. A dark shape that seemed too still, too rigid. My hands gripped my steering wheel as I fought the urge to get out and see what was wrong. That was when I remembered the stories. Mount Misery Road. I should have recognized the name when I had taken the exit off the Long Island Expressway. Every kid who grew up on Long Island knew about Mount Misery Road and its sister street, Sweet Hollow Road. They were legend, the kind of place teenagers dared each other to drive through at midnight, where ghost hunters came with cameras and recording equipment, hoping to catch proof of something beyond the grave. The stories were always the same. Phantom lights in the woods, voices calling from empty air, cars that broke down for no reason in the same spots where accidents had claimed lives decades ago. And the police officer, the one who pulled people over on lonely stretches of road, only to reveal that the back of his skull was missing, blown away by the shotgun blast that had killed him 30 years ago. Officer Michael Donovan, that was his name. I remembered now, the details flooding back from late-night internet reading sessions and campfire stories. He had been responding to a domestic disturbance call in 1992 when his patrol car had skidded off Mount Misery Road during an ice storm. The car had flipped, pinning him inside, and then caught fire. By the time the fire department arrived, there was nothing left but twisted metal and bones. But people still saw him out here, still got pulled over by a police car that should not exist, driven by a man who should not be able to drive. I forced myself to breathe slowly, rationally. This was not that. This was a real police officer, probably wondering why I was driving around lost at 11:30 at night. Maybe he thought I was drunk, or up to something criminal. All I had to do was explain that I was trying to find the highway, that my GPS had failed, that I was just another suburban dad who had taken a wrong turn. Footsteps on gravel. Finally, I adjusted my rearview mirror and saw a figure approaching my car. Tall, wearing what looked like the standard police uniform. He moved with purpose, his stride confident and professional. I had my license ready, my registration pulled from the glove box. Just a routine traffic stop. Nothing more. The officer appeared at my window, and I turned to face him. He was younger than I had expected, maybe in his 30s, with dark hair and pale skin. His uniform was crisp and clean, his badge polished to a mirror shine. I waited for him to speak, to ask for my license and registration, to explain why he had pulled me over. But he just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed to reflect the flashing lights from his car. Something was wrong with his face. The skin was too tight, stretched like plastic wrap over sharp bones. His lips were blue-black, the color of frostbite or death. He tilted his head slightly, and I heard a wet sound, like meat sliding against bone. The movement was wrong, too fluid, as if his neck was not quite connected to his spine the way it should be. I opened my mouth to ask if he was all right, and that was when he turned around. The back of his head was gone, not just damaged or injured, but completely absent. Where his skull should have been was nothing but empty space and darkness. I could see straight through to the trees on the other side of the road, as if he were a living silhouette cut from black paper. My hands flew to the gear shift, but before I could throw the car into drive, he turned back around. His face was normal again, pleasant and professional. He smiled and touched the brim of his hat in a friendly salute. Then he walked back toward his patrol car, his footsteps fading into silence. I sat frozen, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The flashing lights continued for another moment, then suddenly stopped. In my mirrors, I watched as the police car simply faded away, like fog dissipating in sunlight. There 1 second, gone the next. I floored the accelerator and did not slow down until I found the on-ramp to the highway. That should have been the end of it. A hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue, a trick of the light, a story I would never tell anyone because who would believe it? But it was not the end. It was just the beginning. 3 weeks later, I was driving home from a business dinner in Manhattan when I saw the signs for West Hills. Without thinking, I took the exit. I told myself I was just curious, that I wanted to see the road in daylight, to prove to myself that there was nothing supernatural about what had happened. Mount Misery Road looked different during the day. The trees were bare now, their branches reaching across the asphalt like skeletal fingers. I could see deeper into the woods, and what I saw made my stomach clench. Ruins, the blackened foundation of what had once been a large building, hidden perhaps 50 yards from the road. Concrete walls rose from the earth like broken teeth, and twisted metal beams reached toward the sky. Everything was covered in a thick layer of soot and ash that looked far too fresh for something that had burned decades ago. I pulled over and got out of my car, drawn by a curiosity that felt almost compulsive. The October air was sharp with the smell of old smoke and something else. Something chemical and wrong. A historical marker stood near the tree line, so weathered I had to squint to read it. The Hillcrest Psychiatric Hospital, it said. Established 1923. Destroyed by fire 1978. 47 patients and staff lost. 47 people had died in that fire. I stared at the ruins and tried to imagine the terror of that night, the screams that must have echoed through these woods as flames consumed the building. Most of the patients would have been locked in their rooms, unable to escape. They would have burned alive, trapped behind doors they could not open. That was when I noticed the other signs. Missing person posters, dozens of them, stapled to trees and telephone poles along the road. The papers were yellow with age, some dating back years. All of them featured young people. Teenagers, mostly, who had come to Mount Misery Road looking for ghosts and had never come home. Sarah Martinez, age 17. Last seen on Mount Misery Road, October 13, 2018. David Chen, age 19. Car found abandoned on Sweet Hollow Road, July 4, 2020. Jessica Murphy, age 16. Disappeared near ruins of Hillcrest Hospital, March 21, 2021. The list went on and on. Too many disappearances for a place this small, too many young lives vanishing without a trace. And all of them connected to this stretch of road, to these woods that seemed to swallow people whole. I walked closer to the ruins, my feet crunching through dead leaves. The foundation was deeper than it had looked from the road, descending into the earth like a concrete crater. Stairs led down into what had once been a basement level, now filled with stagnant water that reflected the gray sky like a black mirror. At the edge of the water, something white caught my eye. A piece of clothing, maybe, or paper. I leaned forward to get a better look and nearly fell into the water when I saw what it was. A police hat, the same style I had seen on the officer who had pulled me over 3 weeks ago. It floated on the surface like a lily pad, perfectly preserved despite being surrounded by decades of decay. I backed away from the ruins and ran to my car. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A car engine, growing louder, coming up the road behind me. I spun around and saw the patrol car approaching, its lights already flashing. The same car, the same impossible vehicle that should not exist. It rolled to a stop directly behind me, blocking my escape. This time, I did not wait for the officer to approach. I threw my car into drive and punched the accelerator, tires spinning on wet leaves as I fought for traction. In my rearview mirror, I saw the patrol car doors swing open and a figure step out. But it was not Officer Donovan this time. It was someone else, someone smaller, younger, a teenager in a torn jacket, his face pale as moonlight. Then another figure emerged from the passenger side, a girl with long dark hair and eyes that were nothing but black holes. More shapes appeared from the woods around the ruins. Dozens of them, maybe more. All young, all moving with the same fluid, wrong motion I had seen from the Phantom officer. They walked toward my car with their arms outstretched, their mouths open in silent screams. I made it to the main road and did not stop driving until I was back in Nassau County, surrounded by strip malls and traffic lights and all the blessed normalcy of suburban civilization. But I could not forget what I had seen. The missing posters, the ruins, the faces of those lost kids reaching for me through the darkness. I started researching, spending hours online digging through old newspaper articles and police reports. The truth was worse than the legends. Officer Michael Donovan had not died in a car accident. He had been investigating the disappearances around Mount Misery Road when something had happened to him. Something the police report called death by misadventure, but which the witness statements described differently. Donovan had been found in his patrol car at the bottom of a ravine, but there were no skid marks on the road. No evidence that he had lost control or been forced off the pavement. His weapon was missing, and the back of his skull showed what the coroner called trauma consistent with close-range gunshot wound. But here was the part that made no sense. His gun was found 3 days later, at the bottom of the flooded basement of the Hillcrest Hospital ruins. It had been fired once, and ballistics confirmed it was the weapon that killed him. The gun was found 40 yards from where his body had been discovered. There was no way he could have shot himself and then thrown the weapon that far. Someone else had to have been involved. Someone else had killed Officer Donovan and dumped his weapon in that black water where it would never be found. Except it was found, 3 days later, by a search team looking for evidence. The case was quietly closed and filed away. No arrests were made. No suspects were named. The official story became the car accident, the story that people could understand and accept. But I knew better now. Officer Donovan had discovered something in those woods, something connected to all those missing kids. And whoever was responsible for their disappearances had killed him to keep their secret safe. The Phantom patrol car was not the ghost of a dead officer. It was something else entirely. A lure designed to make people pull over, to make them vulnerable. The missing teenagers had not been killed by some supernatural force. They had been killed by someone very much alive. Someone who used the legends of Mount Misery Road as cover for their crimes. Someone who knew that if people started vanishing in a place already famous for ghostly encounters, the disappearances would be blamed on the paranormal instead of investigated properly. I thought about calling the police, about sharing what I had discovered. But who would believe me? I had no evidence, just theories and coincidences and the word of a man who claimed to have seen ghosts. Instead, I stayed away from Mount Misery Road. I took different routes when driving through Long Island, avoided West Hills entirely. I tried to forget about the ruins and the missing kids and the floating police hat that had looked far too real to be a hallucination. But I could not forget the faces I had seen emerging from the woods. Those young people, reaching for me with desperate hands. They had not looked like ghosts. They had looked like prisoners. Somewhere in those woods, in some hidden place connected to the ruins of Hillcrest Hospital, someone was keeping trophies. Someone who had been hunting along Mount Misery Road for decades, using the Phantom patrol car story as the perfect cover. And those missing kids were still there, still alive, still waiting for someone to find them and bring them home. The Phantom patrolman was real, but he was not a ghost. He was something far worse than any legend could imagine. And he was still out there, still pulling people over on dark stretches of road, still making them disappear into the hungry darkness of Mount Misery Road. The only question was how many more would vanish before someone finally connected the dots and stopped him. I pray I never find out. Story 4. Knock That Shakes the Rig. The banging started at exactly 3:17 a.m. and it nearly launched me through the roof of my sleeper cab. I know the exact time because I was staring at my phone, scrolling through messages from my ex-wife about our daughter, this soccer tournament. The kind of middle-of-the-night insomnia that hits when you parked in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, listening to your rig tick and cool in the October darkness. Then something hit my driver's side door with the force of a sledgehammer. The entire truck rocked on its air suspension. My coffee mug flew off the little fold-down table and shattered against the opposite wall. The impact was so violent I thought maybe another semi had jackknifed and slammed into me. But there was no sound of twisting metal, no hiss of air brakes, no screaming engines. Just that thunderous, rhythmic pounding that shook every bolt in my 40-foot rig. Bang, bang, bang. I pressed my face against the sleeper window, trying to see what was attacking my truck. The rest area was dimly lit by a few overhead lights that barely cut through the fog rolling in from the Allegheny Mountains. I could make out the two other semis parked ahead of me, their running lights glowing like red eyes in the mist. Nothing moved between the trucks. No person, no animal, nothing that could explain the assault on my door. Then it started on the passenger side, the same violent hammering, perfectly synchronized with the beating on the driver's side. My truck was being attacked from both directions simultaneously, rocking back and forth like a toy in the hands of an angry child. The sound was deafening inside the cab, a metallic thunder that made my teeth ache. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled toward the front of the sleeper, my heart hammering almost as loud as whatever was trying to get in. Through the windshield, I could see the other two trucks ahead of me. Their running lights were still on, which meant their drivers were probably asleep, unaware of the chaos happening 50 yards behind them. The pounding intensified. My side windows started to rattle in their frames. Coffee grounds and loose change bounced around the cab like hail. I reached for my CB radio, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the microphone. Before I could key the mic, both trucks ahead of me roared to life. Their diesel engines coughed and thundered in the quiet night. Running lights blazed to full intensity. Within seconds, both rigs were pulling out of their parking spots with the desperate speed of drivers fleeing for their lives. That's when I realized whatever was attacking my truck had hit them first. The banging on my doors stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow worse than the noise. I sat frozen in my sleeper, flashlight beam dancing across the empty cab, waiting for the next assault. My breath came in short gasps that fogged the windows. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. I crept forward to the driver's seat and fired up my engine. The familiar rumble of the Caterpillar diesel was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. I threw the rig into drive and followed the taillights of the other two trucks as they disappeared into the fog. I didn't stop driving until I reached the truck stop in Breezewood, 40 miles east. The place was lit up like a small city, with dozens of rigs parked under the bright overhead canopy. I pulled into a space near the diner and sat in my cab, engine running, trying to process what had happened. The other two trucks were already there. I could see them parked on the far side of the lot, their drivers probably inside getting coffee and trying to calm their nerves. I wanted to find them, to compare stories, to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. But first, I needed to check my truck for damage. I grabbed my flashlight and walked around the rig, examining every panel and door. What I found made my blood run cold. There were no dents, no scratches, no sign that anything had ever touched my truck. The doors that had been hammered with such violent force looked exactly the same as when I had parked. But there was something else, something that made me back away from my own rig like it was contaminated. Handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the dust and road grime that coated my trailer. Not normal handprints, but impossibly large ones with fingers that stretched nearly a foot long. They covered both sides of my truck from the cab to the rear doors, as if whatever made them had been feeling its way along the entire length of my rig. The prints were still warm. I could feel the heat radiating from them when I held my hand close to the metal. They glowed faintly in the beam of my flashlight, like they were lit from within by some internal fire. I stumbled backward into the bright lights of the truck stop, my mind reeling. Other drivers moved around me, fueling their rigs, checking their loads, going about their normal routines. None of them seemed to notice the impossible handprints covering my trailer. I found the other two drivers in the diner, sitting at separate tables but both staring into their coffee cups with the same shell-shocked expression. One was a grizzled veteran with gray hair and oil-stained clothes. The other looked younger, maybe in his 30s, with the soft build of someone who had been driving for a few years but still remembered what it felt like to have a desk job. I approached the older driver first. When I mentioned the rest area, he looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. "You were the third truck," he said quietly. "It wasn't to your question." I nodded and sat down across from him. His hand shook as he lifted his coffee cup. "Same thing happened to you," he continued. "The banging, both sides at once, like something the size of a building was trying to shake you apart." The younger driver had been listening from his table nearby. He moved over to join us, his face pale under the diner's fluorescent lights. "I've been driving for 6 years," he said. "Never experienced anything like that. It wasn't the human. Couldn't have been. No person could hit a truck that hard, that fast, on both sides simultaneously." The older driver introduced himself as Earl. He had been running freight through Pennsylvania for 23 years and knew every rest area, every truck stop, every mile of highway between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. "That place has a reputation," he said, lowering his voice. "Drivers avoid it, especially at night. Strange things happen there, always have." He told us about other incidents over the years. Trucks found with their doors ripped completely off, but no sign of the drivers. Rigs discovered parked with their engines still running. Coffee still warm in the cup holders, but the cabs empty. State police had investigated, but they never found explanations that made sense. "Most drivers who park there and experience something done to report it," Earl said. "Who is going to believe them? But word gets around. The smart ones know to keep driving, find somewhere else to take their mandatory rest." The younger driver, who introduced himself as Marcus, pulled out his phone and showed us photos he had taken of his truck. Like mine, his rig showed no damage from the violent assault. But unlike mine, his truck was completely clean. No dust, no road grime, no handprints. It's like something washed my truck while I was trying to break in, he said. Every bit of dirt from 1,500 miles of driving, gone. But I can still feel where it touched the metal, cold spots all along both sides. Earl nodded grimly. It's getting stronger. Whatever lives in that place, it's been feeding on the fear of drivers for decades. And now it's bold enough to attack multiple trucks at once. We sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. The diner buzzed with normal late-night activity around us. Other truckers complained about traffic, discussed weather conditions, planned their routes. Normal problems from a normal world that suddenly felt very far away. Marcus broke the silence first. We should report this to someone. State Police, the Department of Transportation. Somebody. Earl shook his head. I tried that once. 15 years ago. They took my statement, asked if I had been drinking, suggested I see a doctor about stress. Nothing came of it except a mark on my driving record for filing a false report. That's when I realized the full scope of what we were dealing with. Whatever haunted that rest area wasn't just some random supernatural occurrence. It was systematic, intelligent, and it had been operating for years without interference because no one in authority would believe the reports. How many drivers do you think have experienced this? I asked. Earl considered the question. Hard to say. Some probably keep driving and never talk about it. Others might quit the business entirely. Decide long-haul trucking isn't for them anymore. But based on the stories I heard over the years, dozens, maybe hundreds, the implications hit me like a physical blow. Hundreds of professional drivers, people whose livelihoods depended on their reputation for reliability and clear thinking, had encountered something so terrifying they either stayed silent or left the industry entirely. And it was still happening. I thought about the handprints on my trailer, still warm to the touch. Whatever had made them was real, physical, capable of leaving traces in our world. But it was also something that defied explanation, something that existed at the edges of human understanding. We need to document this, I said finally. Get photos, measurements, whatever evidence we can gather. Maybe if enough of us come forward with similar stories and proof, someone will take it seriously. Marcus nodded eagerly, but Earl looked skeptical. You think that'll help? He asked. You think the authorities want to deal with something like this? Much easier to label us as crazy drivers who spend too much time alone on the road. He had a point, but I couldn't accept that we were powerless. 3 professional drivers with clean safety records and years of experience had witnessed the same impossible event. That had to count for something. We exchanged contact information and agreed to stay in touch. Earl gave us his CB handle and channel, creating an informal network of drivers who knew the truth about that Pennsylvania rest area. Marcus promised to research similar incidents online, to see if other truckers had posted about unexplained experiences. As we prepared to leave the diner, Earl grabbed my arm. One more thing, he said quietly. Don, to go back there. Whatever that thing is, it remembers the drivers it encounters. I know guys who got curious, went back to investigate, and were never quite right afterward. Changed, like something had crawled inside their heads and made itself at home. I nodded, but even as I agreed, I felt a strange pull. Part of me wanted to understand what had happened, to confront whatever had terrorized us. It was an irrational urge, but it sat in the back of my mind like a splinter. Over the following weeks, I tried to return to normal long-haul routes. But the memory of that night haunted every mile. I found myself avoiding Pennsylvania entirely, taking longer routes that added hours to my trips. My dispatcher noticed the inefficiency and asked questions I couldn't answer honestly. Marcus kept in touch through text messages. He had found online forums where truckers discussed strange encounters, and the stories were remarkably consistent. The Pennsylvania rest area appeared in dozens of accounts, always described in similar terms. Violent banging on multiple sides of trucks simultaneously. No visible attackers, vehicles left unmarked but somehow changed. But there were disturbing variations too. Some drivers reported finding their cargo rearranged or missing entirely, despite locked and sealed trailers. Others described mechanical problems that started after visiting the rest area. Systems failures that no mechanic could diagnose or repair. The most troubling accounts came from drivers who had returned to investigate. They described a compulsion to park in that same spot, to wait for the entity to make contact again. Several had posted detailed plans to document their encounters, then never posted again. Their accounts went silent, their profiles abandoned. Earl, this warning echoed in my mind. Done? To go back? Ever. But the pull was getting stronger. 3 months after the incident, I was hauling a load from Detroit to Baltimore when I found myself taking an unexpected exit. I told myself I was just stopping for fuel, but the truck stop I chose was only 20 miles from the haunted rest area. As I filled my tank, I couldn't stop thinking about those handprints. They had been so warm, so alive. Whatever made them wasn't just some mindless force. It had intelligence, purpose. It had chosen to attack 3 trucks simultaneously, as if it was testing its abilities or sending a message. What message? And why us? The questions consumed my thoughts as I completed the delivery in Baltimore and started the return trip. I had planned to take Interstate 95 north, then cut west through Maryland, a safe route that avoided Pennsylvania entirely. Instead, I found myself driving west on Interstate 76, heading directly toward the place I had sworn to avoid. The pull was irresistible now. It felt like hunger, like thirst, like every biological drive compressed into a single overwhelming need. I had to return to that rest area. I had to understand what had chosen me that night. I arrived just before midnight. The place looked exactly the same. Poorly lit, isolated, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to absorb sound and light. Only one other truck was parked there, a blue Peterbilt with Ontario plates. I pulled into the same spot where I had been attacked 3 months earlier and shut off my engine. The silence was absolute. No wind, no distant traffic, no night sounds from the surrounding woods. Even my truck seemed to settle more quietly than usual, as if the entire area existed in a pocket of muffled reality. I sat in my cab, waiting. Part of me hoped nothing would happen, that the entity had moved on or lost interest. But a deeper part of me, the part that had compelled me to return, knew better. At 3:17 a.m., the banging started again. This time it was different. Softer at first, almost gentle. A rhythmic tapping that gradually increased in intensity. But there was a pattern to it now. A cadence that suggested communication rather than random violence. I pressed my face to the sleeper window and saw them. The handprints were appearing in real time, pressing into the metal of my trailer like invisible hands were molding the steel. They glowed with that same internal fire, but brighter now, bright enough to cast shadows on the ground. And in those shadows, I could see the outline of what was making them. It was massive, easily 12 feet tall and impossibly thin. Its arms stretched the full length of my trailer, allowing it to pound on both doors simultaneously. But it wasn't solid. It flickered in and out of visibility like a badly tuned television signal. Sometimes there, sometimes just empty air that happened to be leaving handprints on metal. As I watched, it turned what might have been a head toward my window. Where a face should have been, there was only darkness. Not the absence of features, but genuine void, a hole in the world that hurt to look at directly. It spoke without sound, the words forming inside my head with perfect clarity. You came back. The simple statement carried layers of meaning I couldn't fully grasp. Satisfaction, hunger, recognition, and something else. Something that might have been loneliness. Others came back too, it continued. But they ran when they saw me truly. You were still here. I realized I was no longer afraid. The terror that had driven me from this place 3 months ago had been replaced by a strange calm. The entity, its presence filled my mind like warm water, washing away doubt and confusion. What are you? I asked, though I didn't speak the words aloud. I am what remains, it replied. When the road was new, when the first drivers traveled this path, some were lost. Accidents, heart attacks, simple exhaustion. They pulled over to rest and never woke up. Their bodies were found and buried, but part of them stayed. Part of them merged with the highway itself. The blue Peterbilt ahead of me suddenly roared to life, its driver apparently awakening to the same assault I had experienced months earlier. But as the truck began to move, the entity, its attention remained focused on me. He will forget, it said, watching the fleeing rig disappear into the fog. Most do. The fear overwrites the memory, leaves only fragments and nightmares. But you remembered everything. You understood. The glowing handprints on my trailer began to fade, but the entity remained visible in the shadows. It was shrinking, condensing into a more human shape, still impossibly tall and thin, but recognizably the form of a person stretched beyond normal proportions. I was the first, it said. Harold Kettenbach. Detroit to Pittsburgh, winter of 1956. Ice on the road. Truck went into the trees about a mile from here. They found my body 3 days later. But I never left. I've been waiting ever since. The name triggered a memory. I had researched the area, its history after my first encounter, looking for explanations. Harold Kettenbach had been one of the earliest documented trucking accidents on this stretch of highway, back when Interstate 76 was still being constructed. Others joined me over the decades, Harold continued, drivers who died alone on this road, who had no one waiting for them at home, nowhere else to go. We became part of the highway, part of the endless journey. I understood now why he had called to me, why I had felt compelled to return. We were the same in all the ways that mattered. Professional drivers spending our lives on the road, more at home in our trucks than in any house or apartment. Men who measured our existence in miles rather than years. You could stay, he said. Join us. Never worry about schedules or dispatchers or mechanical breakdowns again. Just the open road, forever. The offer was tempting in ways I couldn't have imagined. No more loneliness, no more financial stress, no more wear and tear on my aging body. Just the eternal satisfaction of driving, of being exactly where I belong. But then I thought about my daughter, this soccer tournament, about the text messages from my ex-wife, about all the small connections that anchored me to the living world. Not yet, I said. Harold nodded, and I sensed approval rather than disappointment. When you're ready, he said, we'll all be here. We will always be here. The entity faded back into invisibility, leaving only the warming handprints on my trailer as evidence of our conversation. I sat in my cab for another hour, processing what had happened, before finally starting my engine and driving away. I still run freight through Pennsylvania, but I take different routes now. Not because I'm afraid, but because I'm not ready for what Harold offered. Not yet, but someday, when the road has taken everything else, when there's nothing left but the endless miles ahead, I know where to find them. And they'll be waiting. Story 5. Bride at milepost 58. Some nightmares follow you home. They crawl into your head during the day and wait there like spiders in dark corners, ready to drop down when you least expect them. But the worst nightmares are the ones that might not be dreams at all. I pulled into the rest stop at milepost 58 on Highway 287 just after midnight, my eyelids heavy from 14 straight hours behind the wheel. The place was a forgotten patch of cracked asphalt and picnic tables that the state had stopped maintaining years ago. No lights, no facilities that worked, just a place to park legally without getting a citation for violating my mandatory rest period. My Freightliner was the only vehicle in the lot, which wasn't unusual for such a remote location. The nearest town was 40 miles in either direction, and most drivers preferred the well-lit truck stops with hot showers and 24-hour diners. But I was broke, running behind schedule, and desperate for sleep. I climbed into my sleeper cab and set my phone alarm for the minimum 8-hour break. Within minutes, I was unconscious, the kind of deep sleep that comes after pushing your body past its limits for too many days in a row. The pressure in my bladder woke me 3 hours later. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, still groggy and disordered. 7 in the morning. I had almost 5 hours left on my mandatory break, but my body had other plans. I pulled on my boots and climbed out of the cab, the cool night air shocking me into fuller awareness. The rest stop was dead quiet except for the distant hum of highway traffic and the soft ticking of my cooling engine. I walked toward the concrete building that housed the restrooms, though I knew from experience that they would be locked. State budget cuts had closed most of these facilities after dark, leaving drivers to improvise their own solutions. I was halfway to the building when I decided to flip on my headlights for better visibility. The high beams blazed to life, flooding the rest area with harsh white light that revealed every detail of the abandoned space. That's when I saw her. A woman in a wedding dress stood directly in front of my truck, perhaps 20 feet from the bumper. She was facing away from me, her long white gown trailing on the cracked asphalt like spilled paint. The dress appeared to be vintage, with layers of lace and intricate beadwork that caught the light and threw back tiny reflections. But the dress was stained. Dark patches covered the fabric from the waist down, spreading across the white material in patterns that looked disturbingly like spilled wine or blood. The stains were fresh enough to still gleam wetly in my headlights, as if whatever had caused them was still happening. The woman stood perfectly motionless, her head tilted slightly as if she was listening for something. Long dark hair cascaded down her back, partially obscuring her face from my angle. She seemed unaware of my presence. lost in some private moment or memory. I stood frozen beside my truck, every instinct telling me to get back inside and drive away. But another part of my mind, the part that had been raised to help people in trouble, wondered if this woman needed assistance. Maybe she was the victim of an accident, confused and injured, wandering the highway in shock. I took a step toward her and cleared my throat to announce my presence. She didn't respond, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the sound in any way. It was as if she existed in a different reality, one where truck drivers and diesel engines and rest stops didn't intrude on whatever private drama was playing out in her mind. The stains on her dress seemed to be spreading. As I watched, new dark patches appeared on the white fabric, blooming outward like flowers made of shadow and liquid. The beadwork on her bodice began to dim, as if the light it reflected was being absorbed by something beneath the surface. A semi-truck approached on the highway, its headlights sweeping across the rest area as it passed. For just a moment, the space in front of my truck was illuminated by a different angle, a different source of light that revealed details my own headlights had missed. The woman was gone, not hiding, not moved to a different location, but simply absent. The patch of asphalt where she had stood was empty except for a few scattered pieces of broken glass that might have been there for years. No footprints in the dust, no impression in the gravel, no evidence that anyone had been standing there at all. I ran to the spot where I had seen her, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I searched for any trace of her presence. The asphalt was cold and dry, unmarked by recent footsteps, but when I knelt down and examined the area more closely, I found something that made my hands shake. Drops of liquid that hadn't been there before. Dark, viscous drops that were still wet, still warm to the touch. They formed a rough circle about 6 feet in diameter, as if someone had stood in that exact spot and bled onto the ground. I touched one of the drops with my finger and immediately wished I hadn't. The liquid was thick, sticky, and unmistakably organic. When I held my finger up to my flashlight, the red color was obvious even in the artificial light. Fresh blood. Lots of it. I backed away from the circle and returned to my truck, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every shadow in the rest area now seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound from the highway made me jump and scan the darkness for movement. I climbed into my cab and locked the doors, though I knew that locks would provide little protection against whatever I had encountered. My hands shook as I started the engine and prepared to leave, federal regulations be damned. I had no intention of spending another minute in this place. But as I put the truck in drive, my headlights swept across the rest area one final time. And there she was again, standing in exactly the same spot, in exactly the same position. The woman in the blood-stained wedding dress, motionless as a statue carved from moonlight and tragedy. This time I didn't stop to investigate. I floored the accelerator and peeled out of the rest area, gravel spraying behind my trailer as I merged back onto the highway. In my mirrors, I could see her growing smaller in the distance, still standing in my headlight beams until the curve of the road took her out of sight. I drove straight through to Denver without stopping again, fueled by adrenaline and the absolute certainty that some encounters are best left unexplained. But the image of the woman haunted me, and over the following weeks I found myself researching the history of that rest area. What I discovered made me wish I had never stopped there at all. The rest area at Milepost 58 was built in 1987 on land that had previously been undeveloped prairie. But local newspaper archives revealed that the site had a much darker history. In 1952, a young woman named Catherine Mills had been killed in a car accident at that exact location on her wedding night. According to the police report, Catherine and her new husband were driving to their honeymoon destination when their car struck a deer and rolled over. Her husband survived with minor injuries, but Catherine was thrown from the vehicle and died at the scene. She was still wearing her wedding dress when the paramedics arrived. The newspaper article included a photograph of the accident scene. Catherine Mills had been wearing a vintage lace gown with intricate beadwork, identical to the dress I had seen on the woman in the rest area. The article mentioned that she had bled extensively from internal injuries, staining her white dress with patterns that the reporter described as looking like dark flowers. But the most disturbing detail was in the final paragraph of the article. According to witnesses, Catherine had lived for several minutes after the accident, standing beside the wreckage in a state of shock before finally collapsing. She had appeared unaware of her injuries, unaware that she was dying, unaware of anything except some internal vision that kept her upright and motionless until the end. Since 1987, There had been 17 reported sightings of a woman in a wedding dress at the Milepost 58 rest area. All of the witnesses were truck drivers. All of them described the same bloodstained dress, the same motionless posture, the same sudden disappearance when observed from a different angle. 3 of those drivers had been involved in fatal accidents within a week of their sightings. I found this last detail buried in a forum dedicated to paranormal trucking experiences. The post had been written by a driver named Earl Patterson, who claimed to have researched every reported encounter with the woman in white. According to Earl's investigation, the drivers who died after seeing her had all been involved in rollover accidents, single vehicle crashes that investigators couldn't fully explain. Earl's theory was that the woman in white was trying to warn drivers about dangerous road conditions at that location. He believed she was a benevolent spirit, appearing to those who might be at risk of experiencing the same fate that had claimed her life. But Earl's final post told a different story. He had decided to spend a night at the rest area himself, equipped with cameras and recording equipment, determined to document the phenomenon and prove his theory about Catherine Mills trying to save other travelers. Earl never posted again. His profile went silent. His research disappeared from the forum, and attempts to contact him through other truckers proved fruitless. It was as if Earl Patterson had simply vanished from the trucking community entirely. 6 months later, I learned why. A brief item in a Colorado newspaper reported that the body of a truck driver named Earl Patterson had been found in his overturned rig at Milepost 58 on Highway 287. The accident had occurred during the early morning hours, and investigators could find no explanation for why his truck had left the roadway. Earl had been thrown from his cab and died at the scene, just like Catherine Mills 50 years earlier. The article mentioned that his truck's headlights had been found in the high beam position, as if he had been trying to illuminate something in the darkness when he lost control. I never stopped at that rest area again, and I warn every driver I meet to avoid it as well. But I sometimes wonder if my encounter was really a warning or something else entirely. Maybe Catherine Mills isn't trying to save anyone. Maybe she is just lonely, standing in that empty rest area night after night, waiting for someone to join her in whatever realm exists between the living and the dead. Maybe the accidents aren't coincidences. Maybe they re-invitations. I still dream about her sometimes. The woman in white, standing motionless in my headlights, her dress blooming with fresh stains that shouldn't exist. In these dreams, I always get out of my truck. I always walk toward her. And just as I am about to reach out and touch her shoulder, just as I am about to see her face, I wake up. But someday I might not wake up. Someday I might keep walking, keep reaching, keep moving toward that bloodstained figure until I understand exactly what she has been waiting for all these years. And when that happens, maybe some other driver will spot 2 figures standing in the rest area at Milepost 58. A woman in a wedding dress and a man in work clothes, both motionless, both stained, both waiting for the next traveler brave enough or foolish enough to stop. Story 6. Sounds from the cargo hold. The whispers started somewhere outside Amarillo, and they weren't coming from my radio. My name is Tom, and I've been hauling freight across America for 16 years. Furniture, electronics, construction materials, you name it. Most loads are routine, forgettable, just another paycheck rolling down another highway. But the load I picked up in October from that salvage yard in eastern Colorado will haunt me until the day I die. Reclaimed barn wood. 40,000 pounds of weathered lumber bound for an antique furniture maker in Charleston, South Carolina. The wood was beautiful, ancient stuff with character that modern timber just doesn't have. Hand-hewn beams that had stood for over a century. Planks worn smooth by generations of farm animals and prairie winds. The paperwork said it came from a property outside Denver. Old homestead that was being cleared for development. Nothing unusual about that. Half of Colorado, this ranch land was being turned into subdivisions and shopping centers. Progress, they called it. What the paperwork didn't mention was where that wood had really come from. I loaded the trailer myself at a dusty salvage yard run by a guy named Henderson. Quietly, kept to himself. Didn't make small talk while I strapped down the lumber. Just pointed to where the wood was stacked, handed me the shipping manifest, and disappeared back into his office trailer. The wood smelled wrong. Not rotten, not moldy, but wrong in a way I couldn't place. Sweet and sour at the same time, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I figured it was just age, maybe some kind of preservative they used back in the old days. loaded it up, secured it with chains and straps, started my 14-hour drive toward the Atlantic coast. Everything seemed normal for the first few hours. I-25 south through Colorado, then east on I-40 through the panhandle of Texas. Flat country, endless sky, the kind of driving that lets your mind wander while your hands stay steady on the wheel. But somewhere outside Amarillo, as the sun was setting behind me and darkness crept across the plains ahead, I started hearing things. At first, I thought it was wind. The trailer wasn't perfectly sealed, and sometimes air rushing past at 70 miles per hour could create strange sounds. Whistling, moaning, even sounds that almost resembled voices if you let your imagination run wild during long night drives. But this was different. These were actual whispers, faint at first, barely audible over the rumble of my diesel engine and the white noise of tires on asphalt. I turned down the radio, strained to listen, convinced myself I was imagining things. 16 years of long-haul driving can play tricks on your mind. Highway hypnosis, they call it. Your brain starts filling in sounds that aren't really there. Except these sounds were there, and they were getting louder. By the time I crossed into Oklahoma, the whispers had become distinct voices. I couldn't make out words, but I could hear the cadence of human speech. Multiple voices, overlapping, like a crowd of people talking at once in hushed tones. Coming from behind me, from the sealed trailer carrying 40,000 pounds of century-old barnwood. I pulled over at a truck stop in Oklahoma City, did a full inspection of my rig. Checked every strap, every chain, every inch of my trailer for loose panels or gaps where wind might be getting in. Everything was secure, properly loaded, exactly the way it should be. But the voices continued. They followed me through Arkansas, growing more distinct with each passing mile. By the time I reached Memphis, I could make out individual tones. Some high and thin, like children, others deep and raspy, like old men who spent their lives breathing dust and smoke. All of them whispering, pleading, crying in languages I didn't recognize. That is when the sobbing started. Not just one person crying, but dozens of voices weeping in harmony. A chorus of despair that seemed to rise and fall like a funeral dirge. The sound penetrated the walls of my sleeper berth, followed me into truck stop restaurants, haunted my dreams during mandatory rest breaks. Other drivers started noticing. At a fuel stop in Nashville, a guy parked next to me asked if I was playing some kind of audiobook or music. Said he could hear voices coming from my trailer, wondered what kind of weird stuff I was listening to on my long runs. I told him it wasn't me. Told him I couldn't figure out where the sounds were coming from. He gave me a look that said he thought I was losing my mind, maybe suffering from too many years of solitude on America's highways. Maybe he was right. Maybe 16 years of driving alone across empty country had finally broken something in my brain. But the voices were real enough that other people could hear them too. The scratching started somewhere in the mountains of North Carolina. Not the whispers now. Not the sobbing, but the sound of fingernails dragging across wood. Desperate, frantic scratching, like something trapped inside the trailer was trying to claw its way out. The sound went on for hours, punctuated by periods of silence that were almost worse than the noise itself. I thought about opening the trailer, taking a look at the cargo to see if something had shifted or come loose. But the seal was unbroken, and breaking it would void my insurance and probably cost me the job. Commercial freight doesn't get opened until delivery, no matter what strange sounds you might be hearing from inside. So I drove through the night with the scratching echoing through my cab, with whispers and sobs providing a soundtrack to the darkest highway miles of my life. Praying that sunrise would bring silence, that whatever was causing these sounds would fade with the darkness. But sunrise brought no relief. If anything, the voices became more agitated as I approached Charleston. More desperate, more urgent, like they knew their journey was almost over. I delivered the load to a furniture maker in a converted warehouse downtown. Backed up to the loading dock, broke the seal, opened the trailer doors for the first time since Colorado. The wood looked exactly the same. Weathered barn lumber, carefully stacked and strapped, showing no signs of disturbance. But the smell hit me like a physical blow. That sweet sour odor I noticed during loading, but stronger now. Concentrated, like death mixed with old roses. The warehouse foreman, a guy named Peterson, supervised the unloading. Seemed excited about the quality of the lumber, kept commenting on how you couldn't find wood like this anymore. Hand-hewn beams with mortise and tenon joints, plank flooring worn smooth by decades of use. As his crew loaded the wood onto their forklifts, I mentioned the sounds I'd been hearing. Tried to make it sound casual, like I was just curious about the history of the material. Peterson stopped what he was doing, looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, asked me to describe what I heard. When I finished, he nodded like what I told him made perfect sense. The wood hadn't come from a barn. It had been salvaged from the ruins of the Colorado State Hospital for the Insane, a massive Victorian-era asylum that had burned to the ground in 1899. The fire had started in the middle of the night, spread faster than anyone could respond. Most of the staff had escaped, but the patients were another story. Locked in their rooms, restrained in their beds, many of them had died in the flames. Others had suffocated from smoke inhalation while clawing at walls and doors, trying desperately to escape the burning building. The official death toll was never released, but local historians estimated that over 200 people had perished in that fire. The salvage company had bought the site from the state, spent months pulling usable lumber from the ruins. Beams that had witnessed a century of human suffering. Walls that had absorbed the screams and pleas of the forgotten and abandoned. Wood that had been soaked in anguish and desperation, seasoned with the terror of people who died knowing they'd been left to burn. Peterson said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. Said the salvage company specialized in reclaimed materials from demolished institutions, hospitals, asylums, prisons, places where human misery had seeped into the very structure of the buildings. He said some furniture makers specifically requested materials with that kind of history. Claimed it gave the finished pieces character, a story the customers found fascinating. Ghost wood, they called it. Lumber with a past. I left Charleston that afternoon with an empty trailer and a full tank of fuel, but I couldn't to leave behind the memory of those voices. Couldn't to forget the sound of fingernails scratching against wood. The desperate sobs of people who had died over a century ago but somehow were still trapped in the lumber that had once confined them. I never accepted another load from Henderson as salvage yard, never hauled reclaimed materials again, no matter how good the pay was. Some freight carries more than just weight. Some loads come with passengers you can see on the manifest, voices that whisper stories you don't want to hear. But late at night, when I'm driving through empty country with nothing but darkness and highway ahead of me, I still hear them sometimes. Whispers from the cargo hold, sobs from the trailer, scratching sounds that remind me that not everything dies when the body stops breathing. Some things get absorbed into wood and stone and metal, waiting patiently for someone to give them wheels and carry them down America's highways, spreading their stories mile by mile across a country that has forgotten most of its ghosts. The voices are still out there, riding in other trailers, whispering to other drivers who think they were just hauling lumber. And someday, maybe those drivers will learn what I learned on that October run from Colorado to South Carolina. That the dead dawn to always stay buried. Sometimes they get salvaged, reclaimed, and shipped across the country to become part of someone's beautiful new furniture. Still whispering, still scratching, still trying to claw their way back into a world that has moved on without them. Story 7. Hitchhiker with black eyes. His eyes were solid black from lid to lid, and the door was still locked when he vanished. My name is Dave, and I've been driving these American highways for 22 years. I've picked up my share of hitchhikers over the decades, stranded motorists, down on their luck travelers, college kids trying to get home for the holidays. Most of them are just regular people caught in bad situations, grateful for a ride and a bit of human kindness. But the young man I picked up on Highway 191 through Utah wasn't to regular people. I was running a load of industrial equipment from Salt Lake City to Albuquerque. Solo driver, which meant I had to stick to the hours of service regulations. 14 hours driving, 10 hours off, no exceptions. It was a system that kept truckers safe and other motorists alive, even when it meant tight delivery schedules. The pickup happened around 2 a.m. on a stretch of highway that most people avoid even at daylight. Desolate country, nothing but red rock formations and sagebrush for miles in every direction. No cell towers, no services, no help if something went wrong. The kind of place where a breakdown could turn deadly before anyone found you. That was where I saw him. A lone figure standing beside the road, thumb out, perfectly still in the pale glow of my headlights. Young man, maybe early 20s, wearing jeans and a dark hoodie pulled up over his head. Nothing unusual about his appearance, except for the fact that he was hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere at 2 o'clock in the morning. I should have kept driving. 22 years of experience had taught me that nothing good happens on lonely highways in the small hours of the night. But something about his posture, the way he stood so perfectly motionless, made me hit the air brakes and pull over onto the shoulder. Maybe it was compassion. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else entirely, something that bypassed my rational mind and spoke directly to some deeper part of my brain. He approached the passenger side of my cab without hurrying, walking with a fluid gait that seemed to cover ground faster than it should have. I reached across and opened the door, felt the cool desert air rush into the warm interior of my truck. The young man climbed into the passenger seat, settled himself with economical movements, pulled the door closed behind him with a soft click. He kept his head down, hood still up, face hidden in shadows. His hands rested on his knees, pale and perfectly still. I offered him coffee from the thermos I always kept beside my seat. Good strong coffee, the kind that could keep a driver alert through the darkest hours of a long haul. He shook his head without speaking, still keeping his face turned away from me. We pulled back onto the highway, my diesel engine rumbling as we picked up speed. The hitchhiker sat in complete silence, not asking where I was going, not making small talk, not even asking my name. Just sitting there like a statue, breathing so quietly I could barely tell he was alive. I tried to start a conversation, asked him where he was heading, what had brought him to this remote stretch of Utah highway in the middle of the night. He didn't respond, just sat there with his head down, hood pulled low over his features. That's when the interior light flashed, just for a second, triggered by some electronic glitch or vibration from the road. But in that brief moment of illumination, I caught a glimpse of his face. Or rather, I caught a glimpse of his eyes. They were completely black, not brown so dark it looked black, not pupils dilated from drugs or alcohol. Solid, glossy black from lid to lid, like someone had filled his eye sockets with oil or tar. No iris, no whites, no reflection of light. Just endless, perfect darkness that seemed to absorb photons instead of reflecting them. My heart hammered against my ribs. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead despite the heater running full blast. Every survival instinct I developed in over 2 decades of highway driving screamed at me that something was fundamentally wrong with my passenger. I must have made some sound, some involuntary gasp or stutter of surprise, because he turned to look at me directly for the first time since getting in my truck. Those impossible black eyes fixed on mine, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. It's better if you just don't look. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was no emotion in his voice, no humanity. Just a flat, mechanical delivery that sounded like it was coming from a recording device instead of a living throat. I forced myself to look back at the road, to focus on the yellow lines disappearing under my headlights, to pretend that everything was normal. But my peripheral vision kept trying to drift toward the passenger seat, toward whatever was sitting there wearing the shape of a young man. The temperature in the cab started dropping, not gradually, but suddenly, like someone had opened a refrigerator door. My breath began to fog, despite the heater running at maximum. Ice crystals formed on the inside of my windshield, distorting my view of the highway ahead. I reached for the climate controls, tried to adjust the temperature, but the knobs wouldn't turn. They felt frozen in place, locked by some force I couldn't understand. The cold continued to intensify, seeping through my jacket, through my skin, into my bones. That's when I realized I couldn't feel him breathing anymore. The passenger seat was occupied. I could see the shape sitting there in my peripheral vision, but there was no sound of respiration, no fog of breath in the increasingly cold air. Whatever was in my truck with me didn't need to breathe. I wanted to pull over, wanted to stop the truck and get out and run into the desert, but my hands wouldn't obey. They stayed locked on the steering wheel, following the highway through the darkness while something that shouldn't exist sat beside me in perfect silence. Miles passed, the temperature continued to drop. My teeth began to chatter, my fingers going numb despite my gloves. But I kept driving, kept following that endless ribbon of asphalt through the Utah wilderness, because something deep in my mind understood that stopping would be worse than continuing. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to look, had to confirm that what I'd seen was real, that those impossible black eyes weren't just a trick of shadows and fear and too many years of solitary highway driving. I turned my head toward the passenger seat. It was empty, not just empty, but pristinely clean, like no one had ever sat there at all. The seatbelt was still fastened in its original position. No indentation in the cushion, no warmth left behind, no sign that anyone had occupied that space for the past hour. But the door was still locked. I could see the interior lock button in the down position, exactly where it had been when my passenger closed the door behind him. No way for anyone to get out without me hearing the click of the latch, the hiss of the door seals separating. The temperature began to return to normal. The ice crystals on my windshield melted and evaporated, leaving clear glass and an unobstructed view of the highway ahead. My heart rate slowly returned to something approaching normal, though my hands continued to shake on the steering wheel. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a lonely outpost surrounded by darkness and desert. Checked every inch of my cab, looked for any evidence that I actually picked up a hitchhiker. Found nothing. No footprints, no scent, no physical trace that anyone had been in my truck except me. The other drivers at the fuel stop were the usual mix of long-haul veterans and regional runners. I tried to describe what had happened, tried to make it sound casual, like I was just sharing a strange story from the road. My heart hammered against my ribs. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead despite the heater running full blast. Every survival instinct I developed in over 2 decades of highway driving screamed at me that something was fundamentally wrong with my passenger. I must have made some sound, some involuntary gasp or stutter of surprise, because he turned to look at me directly for the first time since getting in my truck. Those impossible black eyes fixed on mine, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. "It's better if you just don't look." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was no emotion in his voice, no humanity. Just a flat, mechanical delivery that sounded like it was coming from a recording device instead of a living throat. I forced myself to look back at the road, to focus on the yellow lines disappearing under my headlights, to pretend that everything was normal. But my peripheral vision kept trying to drift toward the passenger seat, toward whatever was sitting there wearing the shape of a young man. The temperature in the cab started dropping, not gradually, but suddenly, like someone had opened a refrigerator door. My breath began to fog, despite the heater running at maximum. Ice crystals formed on the inside of my windshield, distorting my view of the highway ahead. I reached for the climate controls, tried to adjust the temperature, but the knobs wouldn't turn. They felt frozen in place, locked by some force I couldn't understand. The cold continued to intensify, seeping through my jacket, through my skin, into my bones. That's when I realized I couldn't feel him breathing anymore. The passenger seat was occupied. I could see the shape sitting there in my peripheral vision, but there was no sound of respiration, no fog of breath in the increasingly cold air. Whatever was in my truck with me didn't need to breathe. I wanted to pull over, wanted to stop the truck and get out and run into the desert, but my hands wouldn't obey. They stayed locked on the steering wheel, following the highway through the darkness while something that shouldn't exist sat beside me in perfect silence. Miles passed, the temperature continued to drop. My teeth began to chatter, my fingers going numb despite my gloves. But I kept driving, kept following that endless ribbon of asphalt through the Utah wilderness, because something deep in my mind understood that stopping would be worse than continuing. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to look, had to confirm that what I'd seen was real, that those impossible black eyes weren't just a trick of shadows and fear and too many years of solitary highway driving. I turned my head toward the passenger seat. It was empty, not just empty, but pristinely clean, like no one had ever sat there at all. The seatbelt was still fastened in its original position. No indentation in the cushion, no warmth left behind, no sign that anyone had occupied that space for the past hour. But the door was still locked. I could see the interior lock button in the down position, exactly where it had been when my passenger closed the door behind him. No way for anyone to get out without me hearing the click of the latch, the hiss of the door seals separating. The temperature began to return to normal. The ice crystals on my windshield melted and evaporated, leaving clear glass and an unobstructed view of the highway ahead. My heart rate slowly returned to something approaching normal, though my hands continued to shake on the steering wheel. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a lonely outpost surrounded by darkness and desert. Checked every inch of my cab, looked for any evidence that I actually picked up a hitchhiker. Found nothing. No footprints, no scent, no physical trace that anyone had been in my truck except me. The other drivers at the fuel stop were the usual mix of long-haul veterans and regional runners. I tried to describe what had happened, tried to make it sound casual, like I was just sharing a strange story from the road. Most of them looked at me like I was suffering from highway hypnosis or too much caffeine. But one old-timer, a guy named Peterson who had been driving since the 70s, pulled me aside after the others had gone back to their trucks. He'd seen them too. The hitchhikers with black eyes. Always young men, always on remote stretches of highway, always in the small hours of the night. They never spoke unless spoken to, never asked questions, never revealed anything about where they'd come from or where they were going. And they always disappeared without explanation, leaving locked doors and empty seats and drivers who questioned their own sanity. Peterson had a theory. Said the interstate highway system had been built on ancient migration routes, paths that humans and other things had used to cross the continent for thousands of years. Said sometimes the boundaries got thin, especially on lonely highways in the desert, and things from other places found their way into our world. Sounded paranoid when he said it, but then again, everything about that night sounded impossible. I finished my delivery in Albuquerque, unloaded the industrial equipment, collected my pay. Professional driver doing professional work, just like I'd done thousands of times before. But I couldn't shake the memory of those black eyes, the way they seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. I'd driven through that same stretch of Utah dozens of times since then. Always slow down when I see hitchhikers now, always take a good long look before deciding whether to stop. Haven't seen any more black eyes. Haven't had any more passengers vanish from locked trucks. But I started carrying a dashboard camera, and I keep my thermos full of hot coffee even when I'm not planning to share. Because I know they're still out there, standing beside America's loneliest highways, waiting for compassionate drivers to offer them rides to destinations that don't exist on any map. The young man with the black eyes is still thumbing for rides somewhere in the Utah desert. Still climbing into trucks and sitting in perfect silence until the moment comes to vanish without a trace. Still reminding drivers like me that not everything on these highways is what it appears to be. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through empty country with nothing but darkness ahead, I remember his words. It is better if you just don't look. Maybe he was trying to protect me from something worse than black eyes. Maybe there are things riding America as highways that are better left unseen, unexplored, unimagined. Things that wear human shapes but lack human souls, hitchhiking their way across a landscape that is older and stranger than the maps suggest. Story 8. Never-ending road. I drove the same 10 miles of highway for over an hour, and my GPS said I was making perfect time. My name is Carl, and I have been hauling freight across America for 18 years. I know every interstate, every bypass, every shortcut between here and anywhere. I can tell you which truck stops have the cleanest showers, which way stations are most likely to pull you over, which stretches of highway will eat up your fuel economy if you're not careful. But I've never been able to explain what happened on Interstate 15 through the Nevada desert that October night when reality decided to break its own rules. I was running electronics from Los Angeles to Denver. High-value cargo that required careful handling and tight security. The kind of load that paid well because every hour mattered, every delay cost money, every mile had to be logged and accounted for. The route was straightforward, I-15 north through the Mojave Desert, then east on I-70 through Utah and Colorado. Empty country for the most part, long stretches of nothing but sagebrush and distance. Perfect for making good time if you knew how to handle the grades and the wind. I'd driven this route dozens of times before, knew every landmark, every exit, every mile marker between Vegas and the Colorado state line. Could navigate it blindfolded if necessary, which was good because night driving through the desert could be hypnotic enough to lull you into dangerous inattention. But that night, the familiar became impossible. I was somewhere between Jean and Primm, Nevada, in that dead zone where civilization disappears and you were left with nothing but highway and stars. My headlights cut through darkness so complete it felt solid, like driving through black paint. No moon, no other traffic, just me and 60,000 pounds of truck and trailer moving through the emptiness at a steady 70 miles per hour. That is when I started recognizing things I'd already passed. At first, I figured it was just desert monotony playing tricks on my brain. One Joshua tree looks pretty much like another when you re-seeing them in headlight beams at highway speed. One rocky outcrop resembles the next when you re-tired and pushing through the small hours of the night. But the billboard was unmistakable. A faded advertisement for a casino that had closed down years ago. Bullet holes clustered around the showgirl, his face like acne scars. I noticed it earlier because of how the light hit the metal, creating shadows that made the woman's smile look predatory. According to my odometer, I traveled 15 miles since first seeing that billboard. But there it was again, exactly the same angle, exactly the same shadows, exactly the same predatory smile leering down at my truck as I passed beneath it. I checked my GPS. The little arrow showed me moving steadily northeast on I-15, making good progress toward my scheduled fuel stop in St. George, Utah. No indication of any problems, no warnings about road closures or construction delays. Just smooth sailing through digital landscape that matched what my speedometer and engine hours were telling me. But the landmarks kept repeating. The same overpass with graffiti tags that spelled out something obscene in spray paint. The same dead coyote on the shoulder, fur matted with old blood and desert dust. The same cluster of emergency call boxes that nobody had used since cell phones made them obsolete. I was seeing these things every 10 to 12 minutes, which meant I was covering roughly the same stretch of highway over and over again. But my instruments insisted I was traveling in a straight line at a constant speed, eating up miles toward my destination. The panic started slowly, creeping up my spine like cold water. I heard stories from other drivers about highway hypnosis, about losing chunks of time during long night runs. But this wasn't lost time. This was something else entirely, something that made my rational mind rebel against what my eyes were telling me. I tried changing lanes, thinking maybe I somehow gotten turned around on a frontage road or construction detour. But there was only one road, only 2 lanes heading northeast through the desert, only the endless repetition of landmarks that shouldn't have been repeating. The fuel gauge hadn't moved. According to my truck's computer, I was burning diesel at the normal rate for highway cruising. But if I'd really been driving the same 10-mile loop for 45 minutes, I should have used up nearly 2 gallons more than what the gauge was showing. My CB radio crackled with static and distance, picking up fragments of conversations from drivers hundreds of miles away. Nothing local, nothing from anyone who might be sharing this impossible stretch of highway with me. Just my truck, my headlights, and the same 10 miles of Nevada desert playing on repeat like a broken record. That is when I remembered something an old-timer had told me years ago at a truck stop in Wyoming. Guy named Murphy who'd been driving since before the interstate system was finished, back when truckers had to navigate by paper maps and local knowledge. He mentioned highway loops, places where the geometry of the road got twisted somehow, where drivers could get trapped driving the same section over and over without realizing it. Said the only way to break free was to do something that violated the normal flow of traffic, something that forced reality to reset itself. Drive in reverse for a quarter mile, he said. Sounds crazy, but it works every time. At the time, I figured Murphy was pulling my leg, telling tall tales to entertain a rookie driver. But with the same bullet-scarred billboard approaching in my headlights for the 6th time, his advice didn't sound crazy anymore. It sounded like salvation. I waited until I passed all the familiar landmarks, until I was in the empty stretch between the dead coyote and the graffitied overpass. Then I pulled onto the shoulder, activated my emergency flashers, and put the transmission in reverse. Backing up a 70-foot combination vehicle on a highway is dangerous under the best circumstances. Doing it at night, alone, on a desert road where other traffic might come over a hill at 80 miles per hour, was borderline suicidal. But staying trapped in an endless loop seemed worse than taking the risk. I crept backward at maybe 5 miles per hour, watching my mirrors, listening for the sound of approaching engines. The desert remained silent except for the rumble of my own diesel and the whisper of wind across open country. A quarter mile took forever at that speed, every foot feeling like tempting fate and physics in equal measure. But finally, I reached what felt like the right distance and shifted back into drive, pulled onto the highway, and accelerated to normal cruising speed. The landscape ahead looked different, not dramatically, but subtly. The stars seemed positioned differently. The shape of the hills along the horizon had changed. The quality of the darkness felt less oppressive. And when I rounded the next curve, there was an exit sign that hadn't been there before. Primm, Nevada, 5 miles ahead. An exit I recognized, a town I stopped in many times over the years, a landmark that put me back on the correct timeline of my journey. My GPS recalculated, showed me right where I was supposed to be according to my logbook and fuel consumption. Like the past hour had been compressed into a single moment, like reality had hiccuped and then corrected itself. I never figured out what caused that loop, that glitch in the normal flow of highway travel. Solar flares affecting GPS satellites, maybe. Atmospheric conditions that created some kind of optical illusion. Fatigue playing tricks with my perception of time and distance. But they never forgotten Murphy, his advice, and they never hesitated to share it with other drivers when the conversation turns to strange experiences on lonely highways. Because I know there are places out there where the rules don't apply, where physics gets creative, where a simple drive across the desert can turn into something that defies explanation. The never-ending road is still out there somewhere in the Nevada darkness, still trapping unsuspecting drivers in loops that shouldn't exist, still repeating the same 10 miles until someone remembers to break the pattern by driving in reverse. And sometimes, late at night when I am crossing empty desert with nothing but stars for company, I check my mirrors more often than necessary. Watching for landmarks that might start repeating, listening for the first signs that reality is about to hiccup again. Because I know that the highways we trust to carry us safely across America sometimes develop glitches that our GPS systems can detect, our instruments can measure, our rational minds can accept. Places where the only escape is to violate every rule of the road and trust in the hard-won wisdom of drivers who learn to navigate by instinct rather than satellites. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes it lets you escape if you willing to drive backward into the darkness and trust that moving in reverse will somehow take you forward to where you need to be. Story 9. Frozen figure on the Manitoba Road. The thing I saw crossing Highway 6 in northern Manitoba was not supposed to exist. It stood 12 feet tall, covered in matted white fur, and moved with the deliberate grace of something that had been hunting these frozen roads long before humans ever laid asphalt through the wilderness. My name is Dave McKinnon, and I have been hauling freight across Canada for 16 years. I have driven through every province, survived ice storms that turned highways into death traps, and navigated mountain passes that would terrify most people. Nothing prepared me for what happened on that February night when the temperature hit -40 and the world became a frozen hell that stretched endlessly in all directions. The job was a rush delivery to Thompson, Manitoba, mining equipment that could not wait for better weather or daylight hours. The company offered double pay for the emergency run, which meant driving straight through the night across some of the most isolated roads in North America. Highway 6 cuts through pristine wilderness where towns are separated by hundreds of miles of forest, lakes, and muskeg that remains frozen solid for 6 months of the year. I left Winnipeg at 8 p.m. under a clear sky filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The cab of my Freightliner was warm and well-lit, a bubble of civilization moving through a landscape that had not changed since the last ice age. My CB radio crackled with occasional chatter from other drivers, but as I moved north, the voices became fewer and more distant until only static remained. The first sign something was wrong came around midnight. I had stopped at a truck stop in Grand Rapids to fuel up and grab coffee. The place was nearly empty except for one other driver, an older Cree man named Joseph who had been running northern routes longer than I had been alive. Joseph studied my load manifest and shook his head slowly. He spoke in careful, measured words, the way people do when they are choosing between truth and politeness. "You driving through to Thompson tonight?" I nodded, impatient to get back on the road. The storm front was moving in from the west, and I wanted to reach my destination before it hit. "Maybe you should wait until morning. Radio says bad weather coming." But that is not the only thing to worry about on Highway 6 after dark. I asked what he meant, but Joseph just shook his head and walked back to his truck. I dismissed his warning as local superstition and headed north into the darkness. The storm hit 2 hours later with the sudden violence that only prairie weather can deliver. Snow began falling in thick, heavy flakes that quickly reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. The wind picked up, creating drifts across the highway that forced me to slow to 30 miles per hour. My headlights cut through the swirling white like twin swords, revealing only more snow and the endless black line of asphalt disappearing into the void. By 3 a.m., I was deep in the wilderness north of Cross Lake. The heater in my cab worked overtime against the brutal cold outside, and frost had begun forming on the inside edges of my windows despite the defrosters running at full blast. This was survival weather, the kind that killed unprepared travelers within hours of exposure. The radio had been silent for over an hour when I saw the tracks. They appeared in my headlight beams like a message written in the snow. 2 parallel lines of footprints, each print the size of a dinner plate, crossing the highway from east to west. The prints were deep, pressed into the snow and ice by something incredibly heavy. But it was the spacing between them that made my blood run cold. The stride was at least 6 feet between prints. Whatever made those tracks was not human. I stopped my truck in the middle of the highway and grabbed my flashlight. The storm had temporarily eased, leaving only light snow falling through the still air. I climbed out of the cab and immediately felt the cold hit me like a physical blow. -40 degrees turns moisture in your nostrils to ice crystals and makes every breath feel like inhaling broken glass. The tracks were fresh, maybe 10 minutes old based on the light dusting of snow that had accumulated in them. They led from the dense forest on the east side of the road, across the 2-lane highway, and disappeared into equally thick woods on the west side. Whatever had made them possessed a stride longer than any animal I knew. I followed the trail for about 50 yards into the eastern woods, my flashlight beam dancing between the towering spruce and poplar trees. The tracks were perfectly preserved in the deeper snow beneath the forest canopy. Each print showed clear definition. 5 toes with what looked like claws, but arranged in a pattern that suggested intelligence, purpose. The sound reached me as I was examining one particularly clear print. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but gradually rose in pitch until it became something between a howl and a roar. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees and reverberating through my chest. Every instinct told me to run. I made it back to my truck in record time and locked the doors, though I knew that thin metal would provide little protection against whatever had made those sounds. I fired up the engine and pulled back onto Highway 6, driving faster than conditions warranted, desperate to put distance between myself and those tracks. 20 miles north, I caught sight of something in my mirrors that stopped my heart. A shape was moving on the road behind me, keeping pace with my truck despite my speed of nearly 50 miles per hour. It ran on 2 legs with a loping gait that covered ground impossibly fast. Even at distance, I could see it was massive, easily 12 feet tall, covered in what looked like thick white fur that rippled in the wind created by its movement. I floored the accelerator, pushing my heavily loaded truck to 60, then 70 miles per hour on the icy highway. The shape fell behind but did not disappear. It continued following, maintaining a steady distance of about half a mile, visible whenever my route straightened enough to provide a clear view behind me. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life with a voice I did not recognize. "Northbound Freightliner on Highway 6, you got company back there. Suggest you keep moving and do not stop for anything." I grabbed the microphone with shaking hands. "Who is this? What do you know about what is following me?" "Name is Frank. I am in a tow truck about 20 miles ahead of you. Been tracking something on this road for the past 3 nights. Big, fast, and not particularly friendly to vehicles that stop or break down." "What is it?" "Locals got names for it. White Walker, Ice Giant, Old Man Winter. Does not matter what you call it. What matters is that it does not like traffic on its highway." The radio fell silent except for static. I checked my mirrors again and saw that the shape had moved closer, now maybe a quarter mile behind and gaining ground despite my dangerous speed on the treacherous road. Then I saw Frank, his tow truck. The vehicle sat sideways across the highway, blocking both lanes. Emergency flashers painted the snow in alternating red and blue light. I hit the brakes and began downshifting, my truck gradually slowing as I approached the roadblock. Frank emerged from his cab as I stopped. He was a big man, dressed in heavy winter gear, but he moved with the quick, nervous energy of someone who was barely controlling his fear. He jogged to my driver, his side window, and motioned for me to roll it down. "You need to turn around right now. Take the logging road about 2 miles back and circle around to Highway 10. Do not ask questions, just do it." I looked in my mirrors. The shape was no longer visible on the road behind me. "Where did it go?" Frank, his eyes darted to the forest on both sides of the highway. "They are smart, smarter than people think. It knows we are here, knows we are talking. Probably circling around through the trees to get ahead of us." As if summoned by his words, the sound came again, that impossible roar that seemed to originate from the forest itself. But this time it was answered by another sound from the opposite side of the road, then another from somewhere ahead of us. There was more than one. Frank sprinted back to his tow truck and began backing it off the highway. I threw my Freightliner into reverse and began the dangerous process of backing up on the icy road in near zero visibility. In my mirrors, I could see shapes moving between the trees, keeping pace with my retreat. The logging road Frank had mentioned was barely more than 2 tire tracks through the forest, but it was better than staying on Highway 6 with whatever was hunting there. I made the turn and began the long, treacherous journey through wilderness that had never been properly mapped. It took me 6 hours to reach Highway 10, 6 hours of crawling through forest paths designed for summer logging trucks, not winter freight haulers. My truck scraped against trees, bottomed out in hidden gullies, and nearly jackknifed a dozen times on ice-covered slopes. But I made it. I delivered my load to Thompson 12 hours late, with scratches down both sides of my trailer and a story that nobody would believe. The dispatcher asked what had happened to cause the delay. I told him about the storm and the difficult road conditions. I did not mention the tracks, the sounds, or the shapes that had followed me through the Manitoba wilderness. That was 8 months ago. I still run freight across Canada, but I have never taken another job that requires driving Highway 6 after dark. Other drivers have reported similar encounters, always described in whispers over CB radio or in truck stop conversations that end abruptly when outsiders approach. The Cree elders in northern Manitoba have stories about things that live deep in the bush, creatures that existed long before humans arrived and will survive long after we are gone. They speak of beings that guard the old places, the sacred places, the places where the modern world has not yet gained a foothold. Highway 6 cuts through the heart of their territory. Frank's tow truck was found 3 weeks after our encounter, abandoned on a logging road 50 miles from where I last saw him. The cab was intact, but the driver's door had been torn completely off its hinges. Frank was never found, and the case was officially closed as death by exposure. I know better. Sometimes, late at night when the temperature drops below freezing, I dream about those tracks in the snow. In my dreams, I follow them deeper into the forest, following the trail until I find their source. And in those dreams, the creatures are waiting for me with patient, ancient eyes that hold no malice, only the certainty that some boundaries should never be crossed. The highway belongs to them after dark. We are just passing through. Story 10. Guardian of Walton. This mountain, I never believed in things that go bump in the night. 23 years hauling freight across America, as highways taught me that the real monsters wear business suits and sit behind corporate desks. That changed on a November night in Virginia, when I learned that some sounds should never be heard by human ears. My name is irrelevant now. What matters is what I experienced on Walton, this mountain, and why I can never drive that road again. The call came at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. Emergency delivery to Richmond, Virginia. The load was medical supplies, which meant premium pay and tight deadlines. I had driven Interstate 64 through Virginia countless times, but never with a mandatory overnight stop. The shipping company insisted I rest at the Walton-S Mountain truck stop, claiming new federal regulations required an 8-hour break. Something felt wrong about their insistence, but the money was too good to question. Walton-S Mountain sits in the Blue Ridge, a forgotten pocket of Virginia where cell towers fear to reach and GPS signals die mysterious deaths. The truck stop appeared around a sharp curve like a mirage of fluorescent lights against the dark forest. Only 3 other big rigs occupied the vast parking lot, their chrome bumpers reflecting the sickly yellow glow of sodium lights. I backed my Peterbilt into the farthest spot from the main building, a habit born from years of valuing privacy over convenience. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and something else, something organic and raw that reminded me of meat left too long in summer heat. I dismissed it as roadkill and settled in for what I assumed would be an ordinary night. The truck stop, this restaurant, closed at 9 p.m., earlier than any I had ever encountered. The parking lot emptied one by one as drivers headed inside to rent rooms or moved on to other destinations. By 10 p.m., only my truck remained in the vast expanse of cracked asphalt, standing like a metal island in an ocean of darkness. That was when the sounds began. At first, I mistook them for wind through the trees. Virginia mountains are known for their strange acoustics, the way sound bounces between ridges and valleys to create echoes that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. But as I lay in my sleeper cab, trying to drift off, I realized these sounds possessed a rhythm, an intentionality that natural phenomena cannot create. The sound started as whispers, like voices discussing secrets in a language I could not understand. They seemed to emanate from the forest surrounding the truck stop, but also from beneath the asphalt, and somehow from the air itself. I sat up in my bunk, pressing my ear to the window, trying to determine their source. The whispers grew into something resembling music, but music played on instruments that should not exist. Imagine the sound of wind chimes made from human teeth, or a violin strung with something that was once alive. The melody was hauntingly beautiful and absolutely terrifying, like a lullaby composed by madness itself. I checked my phone for the time, 11:47 p.m. No signal, as expected on the mountain. The CB radio produced only static when I tried to contact other drivers. I was completely isolated with whatever was creating this impossible symphony in the darkness outside my truck. The music evolved, adding new layers of sound that defied classification. Deep, resonant tones that vibrated through my truck, this frame and into my bones. High-pitched keening that made my teeth ache. Percussion that sounded like footsteps, but footsteps taken by something with too many legs moving in perfect synchronization. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab, determined to solve this mystery with logic and investigation. The November air bit through my jacket as I swept the beam across the empty parking lot. The truck stop building stood dark and silent, its windows reflecting my light like dead eyes. The sounds intensified the moment my feet touched the ground. They were definitely coming from the forest, but they seemed to respond to my presence, becoming more complex and urgent. I walked toward the tree line, flashlight beam dancing across the trunks of oak and pine that formed an impenetrable wall of shadows. 50 feet from the forest edge, I stopped. My beam had caught something that should not exist, a clearing among the trees where the ground was perfectly circular and completely barren. No grass, no leaves, no debris of any kind, just smooth, dark earth arranged in a perfect circle 30 feet across. The sounds were coming from that clearing. I stepped closer, and the symphony changed again. The whispers became more distinct, almost like words in a language that predated human speech. The music grew more intense, more urgent, as if trying to communicate something vital. Something warning me away, or perhaps inviting me closer. My flashlight beam revealed movement in the clearing. Not the movement of animals or wind-blown debris, but something else entirely. The earth itself seemed to pulse and shift, like breathing. Dark shapes rose and fell in rhythmic patterns that matched the impossible music filling the mountain air. I should have returned to my truck. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to lock my doors and wait for daylight. But the sounds held me transfixed, creating a hypnotic pull that overrode rational thought. I found myself walking toward the clearing, drawn by curiosity and something deeper, more primal. At the edge of the circle, I could see that the dark shapes were not earth at all. They were forms, silhouettes of things that might once have been human but had been changed by forces beyond comprehension. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns, creating the percussion I had heard. Their movements generated the whispers, the music, the entire impossible orchestra that had drawn me from my truck. The forms noticed me. As one, they turned toward my position at the clearing, this edge. I could not see their faces in the darkness, but I felt their attention like a physical weight pressing against my consciousness. The music stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the distant hum of my idling truck. Then one of the forms spoke. Not with words, but directly into my mind. The communication bypassed my ears entirely, arriving as pure understanding that bypassed language and reason. You are the guardian, whose guest tonight. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. The forms had not moved, but somehow they seemed closer. The clearing itself appeared to have grown, its perfect circle expanding to encompass more of the forest floor. Who was the guardian? I whispered, though I was not sure I had spoken aloud. The response came as images flooding my consciousness. Walton. This mountain had been claimed long before Europeans arrived in Virginia. Something ancient and patient had made its home in these ridges, something that existed in the spaces between sleeping and waking, between sound and silence. Travelers who stopped here became part of its symphony, adding their voices to the eternal music that kept older, darker things at bay. The truck stop was not a coincidence. It had been built at this location specifically to provide the Guardian with a steady supply of visitors. The other drivers who had parked here tonight were not sleeping in rented rooms. They were part of the clearing, part of the music, part of something that had been growing for decades. I ran, abandoning all pretense of courage or curiosity. I sprinted back to my truck with the inhuman symphony resuming behind me. The sounds followed, growing louder and more complex with each step I took. By the time I reached my cab, the music had become deafening, a wall of impossible sound that threatened to shatter my sanity. I fired up the Peterbilt and fled Walton, this mountain, without looking back. The sounds pursued me for miles down the winding mountain road, audible even over my diesel engine and the roar of wind through my windows. Only when I reached the interstate did the symphony finally fade, leaving me alone with the memory of what I had witnessed. I never delivered that load to Richmond. I drove straight to the nearest truck stop and called in sick, then drove home to Ohio without stopping except for fuel. The shipping company fired me for abandoning the load, but I had no explanation that would not sound like the ravings of a madman. That was 3 years ago. I work in a warehouse now, steady hours and solid ground beneath my feet. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I hear echoes of that impossible music. The whispers find me in the darkness of my bedroom, calling me back to Walton, this mountain. The guardian is patient. It knows I will return eventually. They all do. And late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I find myself wondering if that would be such a terrible thing. The music was beautiful, in its way. Terrifying, but beautiful. The forms in the clearing had looked peaceful. Maybe next month, when the moon is dark and the mountain calls, I will take one last drive through Virginia. Maybe I will stop at that truck stop and walk back to the clearing. Maybe I will add my voice to the symphony that keeps the real darkness at bay. The guardian is waiting, and its patience is infinite. The music never truly ends.